Good morning, San Pablo fourth graders. Good morning, Miss Fox. Good morning, Miss Gilbert. Hope everyone's off to a great day. Let's get right down to business. Milkweed, chapter 12. I continued to bring black pearls to Dr. Korchak and the orphans, and to Janina's back step I brought black pearls and bread. Well, when I could. I began to notice that there was no longer a gift waiting for me. And one day, I knocked on the back door and a man answered. I knew he was a jackboot even in his socks. His gray and silver jacket was unbuttoned, showing a stained t-shirt and suspenders, and in one hand was a stein of beer. "Where's Janina and her family?" I said. He growled something at me in jackboot language. His breath was oniony. I repeated forcefully, "Janina!" He took a swig of his beer and he pointed at the bag of coal in my hand, and I held it out. "Oh, black pearls!" I said. "For Janina!" He snatched them from me, and he pointed at me. "Yuda!" That word I knew. "No, I'm a gypsy." He cocked his head as if to hear me better. I stood at attention. "Gypsy!" He raised his hand, and I thought, he's gonna salute me. But he didn't. He slapped me, and he overturned the stein of beer onto my head. And I snatched that bag of coal back from him, and I swung the bag and brought it down with all my might onto his stocking foot, and he yowled. I ran. One morning, after awakening in our stable as I was walking to the stall where we peed, I saw a man in another stall. He was curled up like a bean, and he was wearing a long black coat. He lay in the straw, and I squatted down beside him. Suddenly, one eye opened and stared up at me. He sat up. "Do you live here?" I said. Straw poked from his head like extra hair. "I live nowhere," he said. "I live here with my friend Yuri. Do you want to live with us?" He looked around as if there was something he could not find, and he shrugged. "Maybe." "Did you once live in a big house?" I said. I was thinking of Janina. "The house was big, but I only lived in 2 rooms." "With your children?" "No, with my books." I studied his face. "You're not a Jew, are you?" I said. His eyes shifted, and he sat up straighter. "Why do you ask?" "You don't have a beard." He stood and he peered into the next stable. "That's because I'm not Jewish. Did someone tell you to ask me that?" "No." He repeated, "I'm not a Jew. Do you believe me?" "Yeah, I'm not a Jew either. I'm a gypsy. I'm glad I'm not a Jew." He walked to the nearest window and looked out. "Oh, glad, are you?" "I think so," I said, "but sometimes I'm not sure because Jews get shot and they have to ride horses backwards and scrub the sidewalk with their beards, but I don't have a beard, and I think I might like to get painted, though." He was looking at me, but he didn't seem to see me. "Would you like some of my bratwurst sausage?" When I returned, the man was gone. And when Yuri and I walked the streets, I had strict instructions. I was to walk as if I knew where I was going. I was to look straight ahead. I was not to laugh or scream or dance or do anything to call attention to myself. Be invisible. "You mean like an angel?" He ignored me. He said I was to look as if I had nothing to hide, as if I belonged here. "Most of all," Yuri said, poking me in the chest, "don't look guilty." What does guilty mean? "It's doing something you're not supposed to do." "Oh, that's easy because I'm not guilty." I had forgotten about snatching Janina's birthday cake. Fine, he said, just don't look it. I found a scrap of mirror and I looked into it and I practiced looking not guilty. I walked back and forth in the stable, looking straight ahead, looking as if I had nothing to hide. And when we went outside, in the center of the city, among the crowds of people, I said to Yuri, look! And I crossed the street by myself. I held my head high. I looked straight ahead. I looked as not guilty as anyone ever looked, and as if I knew exactly where I was going. And I got hit by an automobile. It was only a little bump. The car screeched and stopped and hit me just hard enough to knock me off my feet. The driver was screaming and people were staring, and the next thing I knew, Yuri was dragging me by the collar of the coat and at the same time kicking me in the rear end, and people were laughing at us. Yuri wasn't laughing. He dragged me out of sight into an alley and he dropped me like a sack of coal. Ooh, nice simile. He hissed in my face, did I tell you not to call attention to yourself, you stupid little turd? I looked up at him. I nodded. Back to stupid. I had never seen Yuri so mad. His hair looked redder than ever, only this time it was not because he was laughing. And he punched me in the forehead. The back of my head banged against the wall. Someday I'm going to have to kill you to keep you alive. He flapped his arm. You want to do it your way? You want to go off by yourself and not listen to me? You go ahead. And he kicked me. Go ahead now. He stomped off, and by the time he reached the street, I was back at his side. I was sure then that I would never, ever again disobey Yuri. But I did not know. I did not know about the beautiful horses. The first time I saw it was the time Yuri first took me to the orphan's home. It was in a park within sight of the home. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were horses going in a circle. I thought they were real, and then I saw they were not. They were made of wood, painted, and they were going around and around to tootling music. I ran to them and I just stood there overwhelmed. They were the most magnificent animals I had ever seen. Red horses, blue horses, horses of all colors. They were draped in gold and flowers, and their heads were held high, and their hooves were raised as if prancing to the music, and I barely noticed the children sitting on their backs. Side note, this is a carousel he's looking at. What is it? I said to Yuri. It's called a merry-go-round, he said. The horses went around and around, and as each wonderful horse went by, its large black eyes seemed to look straight at me. They were so proud and high. Oh yes, so proud and high were their heads, and I saw for the first time how miserable the real horses plodding the streets really were. Some of the children bounced and yelled, pretending to gallop, and others looked thoughtful. One child was crying, and grown-ups stood by watching. And someone pulled the crying child from a horse, and I headed for that empty horse, and Yuri grabbed me. No. Why? I said, and I tried to pull away from him. It is not for you. I thought he was joking. Everything's for me, Yuri, I said, laughing. And I believed it. He grabbed my neck in one hand and he squeezed until I couldn't breathe, and he brought his face down close to mine with his pickled breath. No! We turned our backs on the merry-go-round and we went to the orphan's home. And from then on I went to sleep with the tootling music of the merry-go-round in my head. Gold-spangled horses circled in my dreams, and by morning there was only straw in my ears. Whenever we went out together, I tried to steer Yuri towards the merry-go-round, and as we came near, I could always feel his hands slipping around my collar. I'm sure he knew I disobeyed him when I went out by myself. In many days I headed straight for the beautiful horses. But they weren't always moving. Electricity. That's what Yuri once said, explaining why our light bulb used to work only sometimes when we lived like kings in the cellar of the barber shop. The electricity, it comes and it goes. So it was an even grander treat to see the horses moving, and I couldn't resist. That first day I went back alone, I was determined to ride a horse. There was a foot of snow on the ground, but I never felt the cold. Every gilded saddle was occupied by a child. I stood watching. I stood watching them go around and around, and I think my eyes must have been as big as the horses, my smile as wide as those of all the laughing children put together. And then the horse slowed down and came to a stop, and the music stopped. And the waiting people rushed forward and pulled the children from the saddles. I didn't wait. I leaped onto that platform, and I got on one of those horses. It was the most beautiful of all the beautiful horses, and I had my eye on this one from the start. It was as black as the coal dust under my fingernails. It had gold tassels behind its ears, and it had a flying tail and 3 golden hooves on the ground, and one in the air with its head flung high, and its mouth was open as if shouting to the horses of the world, "Look at me!" And for those few moments, I was higher and I was grander than anyone on earth. And then a child was screeching, "He doesn't have a ticket!" And a man came along and held out his hand and said, "Give me your ticket." And I said, "What's a ticket?" And the man yanked me from the horse and threw me face down into the snow. And within moments, a little girl with hair as gold as the horse's tassels stood above me, pointing and screaming, "He's a dirty Jew!" I got to my feet and everybody was staring at me, even the foxes on the shoulders of the ladies, and I screamed back at her, "I am not! I'm a gypsy!" Ew! The golden-haired girl held her nose and kicked me and ran off shrieking. Other children tugged on the hands of the ladies like dogs on leashes, and they flung their faces at me. "Dirty gypsy! Dirty gypsy!" And one by one, the little girls were let go, and they dashed forward, and they kicked me, and they dashed back to the laughing ladies. Meanwhile, the little boys all threw snowballs at me, and I ran. But I returned the next day and the next, and when the horses were moving, I stayed at a distance, watching and just wishing. And one time, when I brought coal to the nearby orphanage, I said to Dr. Korchak, "Do the orphans ride the merry-go-round?" Sometimes I saw the orphans play outside, but never near the merry-go-round. Something sad came over Dr. Korchak's face. "No," he said, "maybe someday." I looked up at his round face, at the fabulous white goatee. "Why not? Is it because they're Jews?" He looked at the merry-go-round tooling behind me, and he looked at the orphans playing nearby. Girls were jumping rope, and he smiled at them, such a smile as I imagine must come from fathers. "No, they're children." There was a question on his face, but I could not answer it. This thing, electricity, I didn't understand it. It came and went without warning. I marveled that without it, lights were dark. The merry-go-round was still, and for 2 or 3 days the painted horses had not moved. I imagined I heard them screaming, "Let us run!" Then in the dark of the stable one night, I awoke to the sound of music, tootling music. Often in the night I heard the music, and Yuri explained that the music was only in my head because the merry-go-round was 2 kilometers away. That's about 1.5 miles. And besides, the merry-go-round didn't turn on at night. No, this time was different. The music was not in my head. I was sure of it, and I went to the window, and a full moon falling on the snow lit up the world. Who needed electricity? And somewhere out there, music was playing. Yuri slept, and I sneaked out of the stable because Yuri no longer tied me to himself, and I went out into the curfew. The music got louder and louder as I came near the merry-go-round. I was right, and I started to run. The snow slowed me down, and there it was. The merry-go-round was on. It was lit up by lights that I had barely noticed in the daytime. The music was tootling. The horses were going around and around, and the lights were blazing, and nobody was there. The mysterious electricity must have come on in the night and awakened the merry-go-round. Side note, when the electricity went out, they probably forgot to turn it off. I climbed onto the beautiful black horse, my horse, with the golden tassels, and around we went. I went from horse to horse until I think I must have ridden them all. I rode them forwards, I rode them backwards, I rode them sitting down and standing up. I don't think I ever stopped laughing, and in the mix of my laughter and the music, I was sure I heard the whinnies of the horses, joyful to be moving again. And then a thought came to me. I stopped laughing. I looked at the dark hulk of the orphan's home, and I jumped down from the merry-go-round. I wobbled and fell into the snow, dizzy from the hours of riding. And I ran to the orphanage. I banged on the door, and I called out, "Dr. Korchak! Dr. Korchak!" A light went on inside, and locks clacked, and he opened the door, and fear was in his eyes. "Dr. Korchak!" I blurted. "The merry-go-round is going! Look! There's nobody there! Bring the children!" And I took a step back and I waved, "Come on!" The doctor reached into the moonlight and he hauled me roughly into the house. He slammed the door shut and bolted it, and he shook me by the shoulders and he snapped, "Foolish, good-hearted boy!" And he hauled me upstairs to a bed. As I went to sleep in the orphan's home, the moon was going and morning was coming, and day was darker than night. And when I awoke, Yuri was downstairs whispering with the doctor. Their cloud breath mingled. And as we left the orphan's home, I waited for Yuri to smack me, to knock my head into a wall, to call me stupid. But he did nothing. He said nothing. And as we walked through the snow, I looked up at him. If only he would squeeze my neck, make me cry. He didn't even look at me. And then and there I lost my desire to ride the beautiful horses, but not to look. And that's the end of chapter 13.